Today we are looking at a case from the early 19th century. So sit back as we go to England. Mary Ashford was born on the 31st of December 1796 in the English county of Warwickshire. At the time of her birth, King George III was on the British throne, and the country was at war with both France and Spain in what was known as the Anglo-Spanish War. Education for girls was not considered a priority. Some were taught to read and write, as well as skills such as needlework. Girls who were able to go to school usually attended a one-room schoolhouse with one teacher, and many children would often be absent for periods of time in order to tend crops and look after relatives. Most children had left school and started work by the age of 10. Child labour was a common practice throughout Britain, and by 1800, in many factories over 50% of the workforce was under the age of 14. Like so many other young girls, Mary went into domestic service, and in 1817 she was working as a general servant in the house of her uncle, who had a farm in the village of Langley Heath, very close to the town of Sutton Coldfield. On Monday the 26th of May 1817, Mary did her usual tasks. She was looking forward to the evening. She was going to a dance in the village of Erdington, just outside Birmingham. It was about 4 miles away from her uncle's farm, and the village was a well-known stop-off location for stagecoaches that passed between the cities of Chester and London. It was also the village where her parents lived and where her father worked as a gardener. The dance was held annually at the 3 Tuns, a pub that was also known locally as Tyburn House, and there was always a large attendance. Mary was quite thrilled to be attending, and when she finished her work, she made her way to Erdington, arriving in the early evening. She stopped at her parents' house to collect a nice dress to wear, before going to the residence of a lady named Mrs. Brady. This is where her good friend Miss Hannah Cox lived. Here she changed, and leaving her work garments behind, Mary and Hannah walked to Tyburn House. They arrived at around 7:30. There were already a large number of people, many who were dancing. The most fashionable dance was a quadrille, a dance that both Mary and Hannah had been practicing. The steps had been published in many of the dance papers, which were very popular during the Regency period. Among those attending was a young gentleman named Mr. Abraham Thornton. He was 24 years old and described as a strong young man. He was the son of a builder from Castle Bromwich, a village very close to Birmingham. Mr. Thornton seemed to be quite taken by Mary. He spent much time talking to her, and she seemed to be very happy in his company. Mary's friend Hannah caught the attention of another young gentleman named Benjamin Carter. They were seen speaking to each other throughout the evening. At around 11 o'clock, Hannah was ready to leave. She had to work in the morning and didn't want to arrive at Mrs. Brady's house too late. She told Mary that it was time they should start making their way back. Mr. Abraham Thornton decided that he would accompany the young ladies. He walked alongside Mary, while Hannah was left alone a few steps behind. However, a short time later, Mary decided to not return to Erdington. She told Hannah that she would instead go to her grandfather's house, as it would mean a shorter journey for her to go to work the next day. This was correct, but Mary had left her working clothes at Mrs. Brady's house. Miss Cox went home, while Mary continued talking with Mr. Thornton. Mary did not go to her grandfather's house, but around 2:45 in the morning, Mr. Thornton was seen by a labourer talking to a young lady. The labourer greeted him, but noticed that the young lady never looked up and seemed to try to cover her face with her bonnet. Just over an hour later, at 4 o'clock in the morning, Miss Cox was awoken by Mary. Mary told her that she needed her working clothes, that she had to be back at her uncle's house before he got up to go to the market. She hurriedly changed, said goodbye to Hannah, and left. She was seen by a young man named Mr. Broadhurst, who had remembered her from the dance at Tyburn House. She was alone and walking quite fast. At 6 o'clock, a man named Mr. George Jackson, who was employed as a labourer, was walking to work when he noticed a woman's shoe and a bonnet near a water-filled pit. When he looked at the shoe, he saw it had blood on it. Looking around, he realised that there was a trail of blood leading to the pit to a nearby bush. Mr. Jackson quickly made his way to the nearest cottage. He knocked on the door and it was opened by a man named William Lavelle. George Jackson explained what he had found, and the two men made their way back to the pit. They were soon joined by other men who were on their way to work. They carefully searched the pit, and to their horror, came across the body of a young lady. She was identified to be Miss Mary Ashford. Some of the men remembered her from the dance the previous evening. The nearby field had only recently been harrowed, and two workers from a local factory found footprints leading from the field to the pits. From their size, they presumed they were footprints of a man and a woman walking together. However, there had only one set of footprints going back from the pits, and they were footprints of the man. They went in the direction of Castle Bromwich. At the time, there was no formal police force in Britain. Law enforcement was mainly undertaken by street commissioners, night watchmen and justices of the peace. When the local mill owner named William Webster arrived, he instructed that the body of Miss Mary Ashford be taken to Mr. Lavelle's cottage, and said that he would go to Tyburn House to try and find out what time the young lady had left the dance, and if anyone had accompanied her. Meanwhile, the footprints were covered with boards, so they could be protected from the rain, and from the many people who would undoubtedly now go to the pits to try and see where the body was discovered. The landlord of Tyburn House was a gentleman named Mr. Daniel Clark. He remembered that Mary had spent much of the evening in the company of a young man named Mr. Abraham Thornton, who came from Castle Bromwich. Mr. Clark offered to go there and try to find him. It did not take long for Mr. Clark to discover the whereabouts of Mr. Thornton. He told him that something terrible had happened and that Mary Ashford was dead. Mr. Thornton replied that he had left her at around 4 a.m, when she had returned to Mrs. Brady's house to get her work clothes. He agreed to accompany Mr. Clark back to Tyburn House. He was met by the local assistant constable, a gentleman named Mr. Thomas Dales. Constable Dales spent some time interrogating the young man. He then arrested him. The magistrate, named Mr. William Bedford, ordered that Mr. Thornton be searched. It was then discovered that there were bloodstains on his underclothing. Mr. Thornton was asked to explain this. He replied that he only realised that he had bloodstains on his undergarments after being intimate with Miss Ashford. His shoes were compared to the footprints found in the field. They were the same size. The post-mortem revealed that Mary had died as a result of drowning, and that until that fateful night had never previously been intimate with anyone. She had also been menstruating at the time of her death. A few days later, on the 30th of May, an inquest was held. It was presided over by the warden of the town of Sutton Coldfield, who was also the local magistrate, a gentleman named Mr. Francis Hackett. Mr. Thornton had been seen leaving the dance with Mary, and one witness claimed that when Miss Ashford had entered Tyburn House, Mr. Thornton turned to him and said, "I have been intimate with her sister 3 times, and would also be intimate with Mary Ashford, or die for it." Mr. Thornton denied that he had ever said this. The inquest returned a verdict of wilful murder, and Mr. Abraham Thornton would be committed for trial. On the 1st of June, Mary was buried at the Trinity Church in Sutton Coldfield. The local people believed that Abraham Thornton had committed this most horrible crime. Pamphlets were printed which described the events of the 26th and 27th of May. These all implied that Mr. Thornton was indeed guilty. The defendant's barrister complained to the judge, Sir George Soley Holroyd, that due to these pamphlets, any jury would go to trial with a biased view against his clients. Nevertheless, on the 8th of August 1817, the trial began at the County Hall in the town of Warwick. Large crowds had gathered outside in the hope of being able to get a seat in the courtroom and view the proceedings. However, only a few managed to enter. The rest patiently waited outside as news of the trial was relayed to them from those who had managed to get a place in the courtroom. Due to the delicate nature of the trial and the evidence that was being presented, women were not permitted to view the proceedings. The prosecution told the court that the accused, Mr. Abraham Thornton, had tried to seduce Miss Ashford, and as she rejected his advances, he attacked her. They said that they believed that knowing the direction she would take when walking to her uncle's house from Erdington, he waited for her behind a bush. He then ravished her and threw her into the pit where she drowned. The issue with this theory was that there were no signs that Mary had put up a struggle. The prosecution, however, added that as the post-mortem had revealed that Miss Ashford had not eaten in the previous 24 hours, it was very probable that she was feeling quite weak and had fainted. The prosecution produced a number of witnesses. Hannah Cox told of how Mr. Thornton had pursued Miss Ashford for most of the evening and had assisted on accompanying her when she left the dance. William Lavelle and Joseph Bird told the court how they had managed to match Mr. Thornton's shoes to the footprints found in the field and by the pits. However, when cross-examined by Mr. Thornton's defence barrister, a gentleman named Mr. William Reader, they both agreed that by the time they were able to look again at the footprints, it had been raining, which had made the task of exactly matching the footprints difficult, despite the fact they had made their best efforts to cover them. The local constable, Mr. Thomas Dales, informed the court that the defendant had told him that he had been intimate with Miss Ashford. He added that when Mr. Thornton was searched, his blood-stained undergarments were discovered. Strangely, however, local constable Dales had not written any notes when interviewing Mr. Thornton, and when in court, could not remember much of what Mr. Thornton had told him. The doctor who conducted the post-mortem was named Dr. Freer. He told the court that there were no signs of violence on the body of the deceased. The defence called a total of 11 witnesses. One gentleman, named Mr. William Jennings, worked as a milkman. In his testimony, he said that at 4:30 in the morning, on Tuesday the 27th of May, he was collecting milk from the farm at Mr. Joe Holden's. He looked up and saw Mr. Thornton walking past the farm entrance. He remembered it well, as he rarely saw people at that hour. The defence outlined to the court that the farm was about 2.5 miles from the pit where the body of Miss Ashford was found. 20 minutes later, at 4:50, the defendant was seen again, this time by a gamekeeper named John Hayden, near his home in Castle Bromwich. Mr. Hayden claimed that he spoke to Mr. Thornton for a while before continuing his journey home. Mr. Thornton's barrister, Mr. William Reader, insisted that if his client had committed the crime, he would have had to have apprehended Miss Ashford, assaulted and murdered her, and then travelled 3 miles in only 11 minutes. In all, the witnesses testified for a total of 10 hours before the judge summed up the case. He told the jury that whether or not the defendant was intimate with Miss Ashford was not relevant. The jury must decide if he had murdered the young lady. He reiterated that Mr. Thornton had not denied that he had been with Miss Ashford until 4 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday the 27th of May. He then said that it would not have been possible for Mr. Thornton to have committed the crime if he had been seen walking past the Holden farm at 4:30 and was in Castle Bromwich 20 minutes later. He added that the defendant did not look like a man who would run anywhere. He ended by reminding the court that it was better for a murderer to go free but an innocent man be convicted. Following the words of the judge, the jury did not leave the jury box. They briefly spoke to each other and after just 6 minutes declared the defendant, Mr. Abraham Thornton, not guilty. The jury were then resworn to consider the charge of sexual assault. The prosecution, however, had no evidence to present to the court. Mr. Thornton was therefore again found not guilty. The judge told him that he was free to go. The verdict was not widely celebrated in the county of Warwickshire. Most people believed Mr. Thornton to be guilty and were disappointed when he was acquitted. People wrote letters to newspapers expressing their displeasure, many of which were published. A Birmingham solicitor named Mr. William Bedford was so incensed with the verdict that he campaigned for funds to be raised so Mary Ashford's brother William could invoke the old legal process of appeal of murder. This process had generally been regarded as obsolete, but had never been repealed by Parliament and dated back many centuries. It meant that a person who had been acquitted of murder could be tried again for the same offence. A writ of appeal was issued on the 1st of October 1817, and on the 19th of October, Mr. Abraham Thornton was rearrested. The newspapers were delighted that he would be retried. As the appeal was to be tried before the King's Bench in London, on the 28th of October, Mr. Thornton was taken to the capital. The case came before the court on the 6th of November, but was adjourned soon after, as Mr. Thornton's barrister, Mr. Reader, claimed that he needed more time to prepare the case and advise his clients. The case was heard again on Monday the 17th of November. It had generated so much interest that the streets surrounding Westminster Hall were packed. as everyone seemed to want to know what was happening inside the courtroom. When asked how he pleaded, Mr. Thornton replied, "Not guilty, and I am ready to defend the same with my body." He then produced a pair of leather gauntlets, one of which he threw on the floor in front of Mr. William Ashford for him to pick up, and thus accept the challenge. The court was shocked, and for a few seconds there was an eerie silence. Trial by battle was another very old statute that had not been used in England since the mid-15th century. Lord Ellenborough, who was presiding over the case, then announced that he would indeed allow Mr. Thornton to defend his not guilty verdict with a trial by battle in order for him to prove his innocence. If Mr. Ashford accepted the challenge and won, Abraham Thornton would be executed. But if he did not accept the challenge or subsequently lost the battle, Mr. Thornton would be declared not guilty. Mr. Thornton was a big, strong young man who had been described in some newspapers as heavy-set, while William Ashford was a much smaller gentleman. Mr. Ashford's counsel argued that Mr. Thornton should not be able to compound the murder of Miss Ashford with an attempt to murder her brother. However, Lord Ellenborough responded, "It is the law of England. We must not call it murder." The trial was adjourned, and over the next few months, the prosecution and the defence argued over the legality of trial by battle. In 1817, this method of deciding if the accused was innocent or guilty seemed rather archaic, but so did the centuries-old statutes, appeal of murder. Mr. Thornton's barrister, Mr. Reader, also pointed out that there had been so much bad publicity written about his client that he would probably not receive a fair jury trial. Mr. William Ashford did not accept Mr. Abraham Thornton's challenge, which meant that Mr. Thornton was eventually discharged. He was by now quite well known in the country, and as most people believed him to be guilty, he found it difficult to find work. He eventually emigrated to the United States, where he was employed as a bricklayer. He married and had children. It is believed that he died in Baltimore in 1860. In June 1819, a bill was introduced which abolished private appeals following acquittals. The bill also abolished the right to trial by battle. No one else was ever charged for the murder of Mary Ashford. Over the years, the case of Mary Ashford was somewhat forgotten, but exactly 157 years later, the people of Erdington were very much reminded of it as they woke up on May the 27th, 1974, to the news of a profoundly similar murder. This mirrored case can now be seen on the brilliant channel, The Crime Reel. I have left a link in the description below. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As you know, I really value all your comments and feedback, so please leave any that you may have. And if you would like to hear about the case that happened in 1974, which is very similar to the Mary Ashford case, please follow the link below. And I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case